Dan Blocker barely saw his loved ones when he was on Bonanza. Dirk, his son, says it this way now. Truthful, little melancholy, and shockingly unfiltered even after all these years. You might recognize Blocker from his role as Hoss Cartwright, the heroic big-hearted guy who gets himself into mischief with a mischievous grin and an unbreakable moral compass. A father who hardly had time to breathe, much less sit down to dine with his children, lurked behind that friendly grin. Dirk reminisces about how, in the 1960s, their dad would always be the center of attention whenever they went to a fair or baseball. A national treasure, Hoss was more than that. Everyone wanted to get a picture with him, whether it was an adult wishing to shake his hand or a child wishing to embrace him. Plus, Dan was quite graceful about it. A quick grin, a sign, a pose, and he'd be on his way. However, that undivided attention hurt his own children. Taking a family to Disneyland and being able to enjoy the rides without being swamped was, in his words, a rare occurrence. Such times were unusual for him. He and his wife Dolphia raised their 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, in the San Fernando Valley. The mansion was enlarged once Bonanza became popular, adding a pool, a game room, and more bedrooms. But nevertheless, information from the outer world managed to get in even then. Dan might have joined the other famous people that call Beverly Hills home. The producers and agents instructed him to do that. People up there claim that the schools are better. This was obvious to Dan, though. Affluent families tend to send their children to better schools, which translates to more tuition. For Dan, that was not the life. He had previously told a reporter that if the Valley schools were good enough for other kids, then they would be fine for his. Truly, he did. Even though Blocker was about 6'4" and 300 pounds, he wasn't attempting to play the part of a showboat. Being a father was his one desire. Someone who literally put his children to bed at 8 o'clock every night after teaching them right from wrong. They had a plan, Dan and Dolphia. Every child was barred from the 8 o'clock club for a full week if they didn't go to sleep by 8. I know it seems ridiculous, but it was effective. The children yearned for a sense of membership. The pattern worked for them. Dolphia was made enforcer by Dan. He was the kind giant, the cuddly one. He went so far as to say that their children were a solid group. However, when you're known worldwide as Hoss Cartwright, your children also notice that. On TV, they see you fend off bandits. They watch as you tumble off horses and take a gunshot to the shoulder while you casually grapple grown guys. Whether it's real or not is irrelevant to them. Of course, Dan assured them it was all theatrical. One of his daughters sobbed uncontrollably during an emotionally taxing scene, despite his assurances that it wasn't real. Despite the slight injury he sustained, she hurried over to examine his head and inquired whether he required aspirin. The friendship was that deep. The performer went unnoticed. Dad was spotted. The bit that the crowd missed was that nobody paid attention to the worried dad who worried he was going to miss his kid's formative years. All they saw was the cowboy and hero. You have to travel to Texas, long before the ranch, before Hollywood, to get it. Dan came into this world in the sleepy little hamlet of DeKalb in Bowie County. He was born into modest means. Mary Arizona Blocker and Ora Shack Blocker, his parents, had a small grocery shop in O'Donnell, Texas. It wasn't the type of area that would often be associated with a potential TV star, but Dan was unique. Literally, even as a youngster, he was noticeable. His stature was proportionate to his age. By maturity, he had grown into a gigantic man. 300 pounds, wide shoulders, and dinner plate-sized hands. But here is the part that most folks miss. Also, he had a soft spot for people and could easily diffuse an argument without resorting to physical force. Following his 1940 enrollment at Texas Military Institute, he attended Sewell Ross State Teachers College and Hardin-Simmons University. Football and drama were his jams there. Very much so. The same man who was a bouncer at a seedy club was also a stage actor. He earned a degree in speech and drama from Sewell Ross. It was his combination of physical strength and stage presence that made him famous. You were unable to avoid him, and you were even less inclined to do so once he began speaking. It wasn't simple, though. Blocker joined the United States Army on his graduation and saw service in the Korean War. Even more than filing documents or peeling potatoes, he was involved. Right there, he was. Men on the front lines, stomping through the muck. In the 179th Infantry Regiment, he was a sergeant in F Company, 2nd Battalion. He was a part of actual fighting, took wounds himself, and was awarded the Purple Heart. He also won a plethora of medals. Numerous decorations, including the National Defense Service Medal, the Korean Service Medal with 2 bronze stars, the Combat Infantryman Badge, and extras. He wasn't feigning heroic qualities. He was one, in fact. He took his time getting back from Korea before rushing to Hollywood. Beginning in Sonora, Texas, and continuing on to Carlsbad, New Mexico, and finally California, he was an English and drama teacher. And he wasn't merely a replacement. In the classroom, he was the real deal. Just pretend that your 6th grade instructor is a cowboy TV star in the making. He was that grounded. After much deliberation, Dan did not permanently relocate to Los Angeles until 1958. He intended to attend UCLA for his education. Might go back to school for a master's degree, but Hollywood had different ideas. A silly part in the Three Stooges short Outer Space Jitters was his big break. He had the role of a space goon and was portrayed by Dirk Blocker. It wasn't flashy, but it did open doors. Things took off from there. In most of his roles, he played a tough guy or a bar bouncer, and he made appearances in shows including Zorro, Sheriff of Cochise, Gunsmoke, and Colt Point 45. Resolute and unwavering. He did the role of a thief in Have Gun Will Travel. He was in an episode of Cimarron City multiple times. People began to take note, albeit slowly. Everything changed, though, in 1959. At the edge of the cliff is where we come to a halt. Since Dan landed the part that would shape his career forever. One that would make him a household name, a TV legend, and finally, tear open his family's private life. But first, the cast and crew of Bonanza, their friendships and rivalries, and the secrets Dirk has chosen to reveal. We must go back in time to the precise second that Dan disembarked from the stage in his costume, took stock of his surroundings, and knew that from that point on, forever would things change. Hoss Cartwright is the first name. There you have it. The legacy is that. By experimenting with a family western, NBC hopes to break new ground in the genre. Yes, they desire activity, but they also desire emotion. A Nevada father and his 3 boys make his home on the enormous Ponderosa Ranch. Every son was expected to contribute something special. Hoss was in search of a large, powerful, and endearing individual. Someone whose bare eyebrow could make children laugh and whose bare embrace could break off a pub brawl. Someone has the appearance of being able to wrestle a horse yet would also shed tears at seeing a limping puppy. That man's name was Dan Blocker. He walks into casting at 6 feet 4 inches, over 300 pounds. But he's not loud, not aggressive. He's calm, warm. His handshake is firm, but his voice is soft. That contrast? It hits the casting team like lightning. They've seen tough guys. They've seen sweet guys. But both in one? That's rare. That's House. And just like that, Dan lands the role. Over the next 13 years, he appears in 415 episodes, one of the highest counts for any cast member. Bonanza runs from 1959 to 1972. Becoming the second longest running Western in NBC history at the time. At its peak, it pulls in tens of millions of viewers every week. People don't just watch Hoss. They wait for him. They cheer when he shows up. They laugh when he fumbles over his words. They trust him. Now here's something you might not know. Dan didn't play Hoss like a cowboy caricature. He had a guiding thought, an old quote that stuck with him. Every time he stepped into Hoss's boots, he thought about kindness. About doing good while you can, because as he once explained, we only pass this way once. And viewers felt that, especially kids. Over the years, Dan got letters, hundreds of them. One from a boy simply said, "I wish you were my dad." That hit him hard. It wasn't about stardom. It wasn't about ratings. It was about what Hoss stood for: safety, loyalty, love. That letter stayed with Dan. It made every long shoot, every missed family dinner feel a little more worth it. But even as the show climbs in ratings, Dan doesn't slow down. He works outside of Bonanza too. In 1963, he stars in Come Blow Your Horn alongside Frank Sinatra. Then again in 1968 in Lady and Cement. That time he plays a tough guy, something totally opposite from Hoss. And it works. He's intimidating when he wants to be. Later, Stanley Kubrick considers casting him in Dr. Strangelove to play Major T.J. King Kong. That's the role that ends up writing the atomic bomb in the final scene. But Dan never takes the part. His agent turns it down before he even gets a chance to read it. Slim Pickens ends up doing it. But film historians still wonder, what if Blocker had said yes? Still, Dan isn't hurting for projects. In 1968, he stars in Something for a Lonely Man. He plays a blacksmith named John Killebrew who starts a new town from scratch. The story is all heart and fans love it. Then in 1970, he shifts gears again in The Cockeyed Cowboys of Calico County. This time it's comedy. He plays a shy bachelor with a clumsy charm. And the cast? Packed with legends like Jim Backus, Mickey Rooney, and Jack Elam. But here's the part that really surprises people. Dan Blocker isn't just acting, he's building a brand. In 1963, he becomes part owner of a new restaurant chain called Bonanza Steakhouse. The hook? Dan makes appearances as Hoss. He's on the ads. He shows up at openings and yes, he shakes every hand, signs every menu and takes every picture. The business grows fast. People trust Hoss. And if Hoss says the steak is good, well, you believe him. And Dan doesn't do it alone. In 1964, his son Dirk joins him on screen for the first time. It's a car commercial, a small moment, but a big one for the Blocker family. Dirk later says it's one of his earliest memories of his dad's career. Not the TV set, not the ranch, but a commercial. Just the two of them, smiling, working together. That's how deep the bond went. Now you might think success like that would go to a man's head, but not Dan. He stays grounded. He stays humble. He never forgets where he came from. He makes friends on set, including a young director named Robert Altman. They hit it off. Years later, Altman wants Dan for The Long Goodbye. He wants him to play Roger Wade. But before filming starts, tragedy strikes. Dan passes away suddenly. And the role goes to Sterling Hayden. The final cut of the film is dedicated to Dan Blocker. By now, Bonanza is nearing its final seasons. The audience is changing. TV is changing. But Dan? He's still showing up, still cracking jokes between takes, still making time for every fan, and still going home every night to the valley to his wife and kids. But behind the success, the steakhouse, the fame, the pressure starts to build. Dan's health becomes a concern. He's been big all his life, and now that weight is catching up with him. He pushes through it, keeps working, keeps smiling, but those closest to him start to worry. Dirk remembers those final years, the long shoots, the quiet moments at home, and those memories are about to take center stage. So what was life really like for the Blockers outside the studio lights? And what finally broke the man fans thought was unbreakable? Behind the smile and cowboy hat, Dan Blocker lived a life filled with purpose, conviction, and quiet love for his family. Off camera, he wasn't a TV legend. He was a father, a husband, and a man rooted in values. He married Dolphia Parker, the woman he met at Sul Ross State University. And together, they raised 4 children in Los Angeles. They had 2 daughters, Dana Lynn and Deborah Lee, and 2 sons, David and Dirk. And every one of them felt the impact of Dan's enormous presence. David Blocker became a successful Hollywood producer. In 1998, he won an Emmy for producing Don King, Only in America. Dirk, meanwhile, pursued acting, continuing the Blocker name in front of the camera. But growing up, they all felt what fans only guessed at, how much Dan gave to his family, even as he gave so much to his work. Dan wasn't flashy about his beliefs, but he stood strong for them. He was a free Methodist and a proud Democrat. He publicly supported California Governor Pat Brown in 1966 and later backed presidential candidates Eugene McCarthy and Hubert Humphrey. In the middle of the Hollywood spotlight, when silence would have been safer, Dan spoke out. He had fun too. He loved performance cars like his 1965 Chevrolet Chevelle SS396 Z16. He owned a Huffaker Genie 10 Malawian Quatches race car nicknamed the Vinegaroon, which competed in real road racing championships, including the Can-Am series. Dan had a passion for speed that matched his larger-than-life energy, but none of that could stop what happened in 1972. At just 43 years old, Dan Blocker went in for a routine gallbladder surgery at Daniel Freeman Hospital in Los Angeles. He never came home. A blood clot, sudden and unexpected, traveled to his lungs. He died of a pulmonary embolism on May 13, 1972. The man known as Hoss Cartwright, the gentle giant of American television, was gone. And that loss wasn't just felt by fans. Bonanza had to face something no show had ever done before, acknowledge that one of its stars had died. Hoss's death was written into the 14th and final season, though the details were never fully shown. In a later spin-off, a character finally said it. Hoss died trying to save someone else. It was the kind of ending that matched the man. Selfless, brave, quietly heroic. But Bonanza was never the same. That final season struggled. Ratings dropped. The chemistry shifted. Without Hoss, the show lost its heart. Michael Landon, one of Dan's closest friends on the cast, once said he could always cry on cue. He just thought about Dan. That tells you everything. Dan was buried in Woodman Cemetery in DeKalb, Texas. No golden statue, no Hollywood glitz, just a plain headstone marked by a Dan D. Blocker next to his father, mother, and sister. It's simple. Honest. And exactly what he would have wanted. Still, the world hasn't forgotten him. There's a Dan Blocker room in the O'Donnell Heritage Museum in Texas. Dan Blocker Beach sits on the California coast in Malibu. Dan Blocker Avenue winds through a quiet neighborhood in Henderson, Nevada. His legacy is quite literally part of the landscape. And Dirk carried that legacy forward. He made his first appearance with Dan in a 1964 car commercial. He was just a kid, standing beside the man the world knew as Hoss. From there, Dirk built his own path in TV. He landed guest roles in shows like Little House on the Prairie, The X-Files, Matlock, Walker, Texas Ranger, Ships and more. From 1976 to 1978, he played Lieutenant Jerry Bragg on Baba, Black Sheep. Then after decades of guest work, he finally landed another major role, Detective Hitchcock on Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Running from 2013 to 2021. But Dirk's story didn't stop at acting. He went back to school, earned his degree, and even became a teacher. In 2017, he published a children's book, Master and the Little Monk, a quiet, heartfelt story that mirrors so much of the emotional depth his father brought to the screen. And now, at 67, Dirk Blocker is finally telling the full story. Not the TV version, not the fan magazine tribute, but the real one. The one that shows who Dan Blocker really was as a father, a husband, a teacher, a veteran, a Hollywood outlier, and, maybe most importantly, a man who never let success erase his humanity. So when you think of Hoss Cartwright, don't just remember the cowboy on your screen. Remember the dad who made it home in time for bedtime stories, the war hero who stood tall without ever shouting. The actor who made the whole world feel safe for 1 hour every Sunday night. And the son who, all these years later, still carries that story with pride. And finally, after decades of silence, is ready to let you in. Because now, you know the truth.